Hi, everyone, and welcome. I am very pleased today to be joined by Colonel Jacques Baud from the Swiss Strategic Intelligence Service, at least, yeah, retired now, and also should be added, quite a prolific author, and yeah, just yeah, one book after the other, and yeah, one more excellent than the former. So it's a great privilege. I've been yeah reading your stuff and heard a lot about you, so it's great to finally, yeah, meet you almost in person.
Thank you very much for the kind words and for inviting me to your show. I look at your show very often with the various interviews. I'm very honored to be interviewed. Thank you.
Well, thank you. And I thought there's a lot I want to discuss, primarily around the whole failure of diplomacy and how we ended up, at least in Europe, only considering war, which is quite a tragedy. But I thought perhaps we could start off with the most recent development, which has been this US-Ukrainian ceasefire deal, where they now suggest, yes, there's a 30-day ceasefire, and now they will put it to the Russians. And in Marco Rubio's words, the ball is in Russia's court. This yeah, this seems to contradict most, well, all of what Russia has put forth. But again, one shouldn't oversimplify it. I think there's been some almost excitement in Europe that the Russian can't accept it, and then the Americans will join Camp Europe and Zelensky against Russia again. But how are you seeing this or reading this situation?
Well, first of all, I think this conflict, this particular conflict, has there are a lot of misconceptions around the conflict. First of all, the reason why it erupted, how it developed, what was the objective, and all that. And we see in the phase we are living on today, which is the attempt of the US to impose or facilitate a solution, depending on you see that, facilitate a solution about it. We see also a lot of misunderstanding and misconception. I live in Brussels, and of course, here in Brussels, you see that the wording is extremely propagandistic, and every single attempt to even talk to the Russians is considered as taking side with Russians, which is quite surprising. And I remember one of good friend of mine, old friend of mine that used to be the Swiss ambassador to Kiev until last year, Claude Wild, once interviewed at the Swiss TV. He said, "Well, talking to the Russians would be rewarding the aggressor." And I think that summarized very much what you see in the media, that even talking to Russia is already a problem. And when Trump came and said he wanted, no, when he came, I mean, in fact, he said that well before coming, because we know that he wanted to solve the problem already last year. But when he said that he wanted to find a solution, and he started to have the discussion with the Russians 10, 15 years ago, days ago. Everybody said, well, they tried to make out a deal without considering the Ukrainians. And as we know, the first discussions between US and Russia was about reestablishing diplomatic contact. So it was about reestablishing a communication line, if you want, at diplomatic level, of course, and all the nitty-gritty that goes along with that. And what we had 2 days ago with this meeting in Jeddah between the Ukrainians and the Americans was, in fact, a part of the problem the Americans have is to convince the Ukrainians to go and sit at the negotiation table. And the Ukrainians are extremely reluctant to do that. We can discuss that later, but to summarize, they are reluctant to do that. And the Americans tried to put pressure on them to have a position. And in fact, what was discussed in Jeddah was not so much what kind of solution we may have for a peace with the Russians, but a position for the Ukrainians to start the process. And I think the Americans understand, and probably the Russians also, although they have already set what are the basic conditions they want to have for negotiation. But for the Americans, I think they are aware that a peace process is precisely a process. That means you at least have to define a starting position, and then there must be an iteration, an iterative process between the two parties to have at the end a common position on an agreement. But it has to depart from somewhere. And I think that's what the Americans tried to do with the Ukrainians. And obviously, if you read, I mean, I don't know the details, but when I went to the website of the State Department, the US State Department, I had an idea of the content of this position. Obviously, this is not a position that is, in my view, at this stage, acceptable to the Russians. But my understanding is that the Americans are aware of that. And they know that, and they probably want to encourage the Ukrainians to start with that and discuss based on that to achieve something else. That's my personal view of that. But certainly, what has been decided in Jeddah is certainly not something. In fact, it even contradicts what the Russians wanted, because in June last year, on the 14th of June, as Putin addressed the officials of the foreign ministry in Russia, in Moscow, he sets a few milestones, if you want, or conditions, preconditions to engage into negotiation. And he said, to start with, there will be no ceasefire. If the Ukrainians are okay to start a discussion, then of course the weapons can stop firing, but it will not be a ceasefire for nothing, and then probably a process. The ceasefire, if there is a ceasefire, as I understand it, it must be part of the process. And if I read the document that was published on the Rubio's, I mean, the State Department website, I don't see this ceasefire as a departure of a process. In fact, it's just 30 days period, but there's no conditions linked to this ceasefire, and that's something the Russians will probably want to discuss. And they may agree with a ceasefire, but under the condition that the ceasefire leads to somewhere. That's my personal view on that.
Well, well, I guess one of the reasons why the Russians are so reluctant to accept a temporary ceasefire is they, as you suggested, they're quite concerned that this will simply be used as a temporary pause to rearm the Ukrainians. And I guess this is part of the contradiction of, not contradiction, but interesting element, the fact that now the Americans are starting to give weapons against to the Ukrainians. But I agree with your assessments on the purpose of the ceasefire, though, to perhaps it's just to appease some of the more Russia hawks within the U.S. to get the Ukrainians pulled a bit further towards negotiations, given how reluctant they've been even to consider such a thing as a ceasefire, but also possibly to get the Europeans at least to talk about peace as well. So it could be just part of a process. I guess we'll find out if they now saying to the Russians, take it or leave it, or will sanction you. They will be problematic. But in terms of the Russians being roped into a temporary ceasefire, the key thing the Russians always bring up is the Minsk agreement, because they've done this in the past. These 7 years of Minsk, where they where Well, they argue that the West merely used this to buy time and yeah, pump Ukraine full of weapons to change realities on the ground. But I also seen that Macron has argued that that it was Russia who breached the Minsk agreement. So, and I know that this war is to a large extent about a war of narratives, but what happened with the Minsk agreement? Because this is something that you have really explored and written about. Because I think this is very important. Because if you just follow the news, one gets the impression that Russia breached the Minsk agreement and it was all Russia's fault. I think this is yeah fascinating.
Absolutely. I think the Minsk, I have studied especially exactly what the start of the Russian military operation. I mean, everything that happens just before and the application or implementation of the Minsk agreement. Now, a commonly made mistake is that to assume that the Minsk agreement was an agreement between Russia and Ukraine. And that's wrong. I mean, if you read the Minsk agreement, both Minsk agreements, by the way, the first that was signed in September 2014, and the second, which was signed in February 2015, the two agreements were in fact agreement between the authorities of some areas of the oblast of Lugansk and Donetsk. That's the abbreviation in Ukrainian is Ordlo. Ordlo. There are separate, a special region of the Donetsk and Lugansk oblasts. That's Ordlo. And the authorities of the Ordlo and Kiev and Russia and for the Ordlo and on the other side for Kiev, Germany and France were the guarantors of the conflict. So that means that they were committed to not force, but to convince the parties to implement the agreement. And you can see that even during um, the presidency of François Hollande, so from 2015 and onwards until 17, when Emmanuel Macron came, the French made every effort to have this internal agreement to make it as an international agreement. And for that, the French have always promoted the so-called format Normandy, the Normandy format, which in fact was a format that had been defined, I think it was 2014, as you had the celebration for the D-Day in Normandy. And on this occasion, Vladimir Putin, Petro Poroshenko, François Hollande, of course, and Angela Merkel were present. And they started to have talk about the situation and all that. And that's what the French called the format Normandy. And they wanted to have the solution of the conflict in Ukraine on this base. But notice that the format Normandy is a format that includes all the head of state of states. I mean, Russia, Ukraine, France, and Germany, but doesn't include those who were in fact included in the Minsk agreement, which were the authorities of the Ordlo, these the regions and François Hollande in the first phase, and then Emmanuel Macron made every effort to have a solution in the framework of the format Normandy. And we have a very clear example of that because one of the last phone call between Emmanuel Macron and Vladimir Putin happened, that was on the 20th of February, I think, 2022. And incidentally, there were people in the office of Emmanuel Macron, and they recorded this phone call. And therefore, we have the transcript of that. It was published in France, at least. It was probably published elsewhere, but at least in French. And here we see that Emmanuel Macron doesn't, in fact, he has not even read the Minsk agreement, because, and that was even the title of a media in France, that was, "We don't care about the separatists." And as I said, the Minsk agreement was precisely to establish a dialogue between the so-called separatists, which have never been separatists, by the way, it was autonomists, but between the autonomists and Kiev. That was the purpose of the Minsk agreement. That was to define a framework for this dialogue. And Emmanuel Macron said, just regarding this, he said, we don't care about the separatists, meaning that he obviously didn't understand or didn't read the Minsk agreement. And I think the whole problem related to the implementation of this agreement relates to that. This is a confusion between the kind of treaty it is. And we have also a declaration from Ursula von der Leyen in 2021, where she said, Russia is not implementing, therefore we don't have to talk to Russia and things like this. So this is, I think, the main thing. Now, the idea of the Minsk agreement and the first draft of the agreement in September, that goes back to August or September 2014. It was drafted with the help of Heidi Tagliavini. Heidi Tagliavini she was a Swiss diplomat, and at that time she was working for the OSCE. And she was the envoy for Ukraine, and she helped to draft the first draft of those agreements. And those agreements contain elements. I mean, for a Swiss, it's very easy to detect that, because you have element of the Swiss federal solution. Because we have to remember that the whole issue in Ukraine was triggered by on the 23rd of February 2014, when the new authorities of Kiev, unelected, changed the status of the Russian language. I mean, Russian language, based on the law of 2012, the law Kivalov-Kolynechenko, was a law that established both Russian and Ukrainian as the two official languages of Ukraine. And on the 23rd of February 2014, the new elected authorities degraded the status of the Russian language. That means that from that point, the Russian population in Ukraine was still allowed to use Russian. It was not forbidden. They never forbade Russian, except in school and things like this. But for the general use, it was not forbidden. But the problem is that all interaction between the citizen and the administration could no longer happen in Russian. Everything was to be said in Russian. So for the Russian population, it was a very significant change. And for that reason, from the very first day, that means the 23rd of February 2014, up to the Minsk agreement, basically, the whole south of Ukraine, not just the Donbass, but the whole south of Ukraine erupted, and you had demonstration everywhere. I mean, you had thousands of locations. I mean, villages, hamlets, cities, you name it, where you had demonstrations from the Russian population. And the repression of this uprising was extremely brutal. The Ukrainian army, who used to be involved in this repression, didn't want to go along. I mean, those Russian-speaking soldiers defected, And that prompted then the use of paramilitary forces and all that. And that led to the situation that we had eventually in 2020, in 2021. In 2021, a very important thing that is always omitted by the historians and the press is the decree published by Volodymyr Zelensky on the 24th of March 2021, which a decree reclaiming the sovereignty over Crimea and the south of the country. And from that point on, you had an increase of military pressure on the Donbass. They started to build the fortification that we are still hearing about with Pakrovsk, Severodonetsk, and all that. And that, in fact, prompted, and in my books, I published even the figures provided by the International Crisis Group, which is, by the way, funded by the Swiss government or even John Soros and all that. So nothing from the Kremlin. But they demonstrated that from the end of March 2021, you had a first increase on violations and artillery fire on the Donbass. And this artillery fire increased further in a factor of 3 or 4 in mid-February 2022. And that's what prompted the Russian action. And the Russian action is very interesting to study also because despite all the requests coming from the Donbass for for those republics to enter the Russian Federation, Putin always refused that because he said we have the Minsk agreement, and the Minsk agreement should be the platform to solve the conflict, and he refused to integrate or annex or integrate those republics into Russia. But if you remember, Joe Biden on the 16th of before the 16th of February 2022, he said, "I know that the Russians will start to attack on the 16th of February." You may remember that. And on the thing is that on the 16th of February, you see the dramatic increase of artillery fire on the Donbass. And the Americans and the Ukrainians probably anticipated that the offensive that was to be launched in February against the Donbass would trigger a Russian intervention. In fact, everything indicates, and you may remember also the famous interview of Alexei Arestovich from the 18 March 2019, where he explains the process, that it has to be an open conflict with Russia in order to allow Ukraine to enter NATO. And that was the whole issue. And that was designed to start in mid-February 2022. And on the 15th, that meant one day before, the Duma or some deputies of the Duma asked Vladimir Putin to recognize the independence of the two republics of the Donbass. And Putin refused then. But then he changed his mind 2 days later because of this artillery fire that was started against the Donbass, or that was increasing on the Donbass. And from that point, you had a very, very interesting calculation from the Russians, because they decided that they would recognize the independence of the two republics, because they considered that at that point the Minsk agreement was dead, and therefore they could afford to recognize the two republics. By recognizing the two republics, they could have a treaty passed with them and the Russian Federation, a friendship and assistance treaty. This treaty was passed on the 21st of February 2022. It was ratified by the parliament of the Republic of Lugansk, the one of Donetsk, and the Duma in Moscow. And based on this ratification, the two republics could then ask to activate the treaty and ask for assistance on the 23rd of February. And based on that, Russia could invoke the Article 51 of the UN Charter and intervene under the label or the principle of the responsibility to protect. And in fact, if you read, if you go on the UN website, you have the condition of the responsibility to protect, and you will see that there are three pillars. I don't want to go into the details, but the third pillar provides for the possibility to intervene in a country to protect a population, and to do that in the framework of the Article 51 of the UN Charter, which is collective defense or something like that. And that's exactly what the Russians have done. So it's a little bit tricky, but legally it was dictated by the situation. But it shows that the Russians don't do, they are not hip shooters. When they do plan things, it's carefully planned. It's they think about it thoroughly, and when they start their operation, this is something that has been very much discussed and planned, and it's not just something that comes out of nowhere. So that's in a nutshell the situation.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting what you said about who's the guarantors versus who's the parties of the conflict, because when you read through the Minsk agreement, Russia's not mentioned, and yet we get this argument that Russia didn't implement it. But this was also something we saw throughout the years, which was now, well, we demand effectively that Russia recognizes that it's part of this conflict. And of course, you can make that argument that this war has many layers. You have a domestic issue, you have and then they have the external actors, but Russia being a part, much like NATO being a part as well. But but in terms of the specific articles in this agreement, they did have some specific issues like withdrawing heavy weapons, but also starting diplomacy with Donbass. What was the main problem with getting this Kiev engaging Donbass in diplomacy? Because they were going to discuss and grant it autonomy through these constitutional changes. This really never moved forward, though.
Well, if you read the Minsk agreement, you would see, as I said, it was initially designed by a Swiss diplomat with probably the Swiss model in mind, in which you allow some kind of autonomy of the various regions in terms of their customs, in terms of language, religion, and practices and things like this. And you could, if you read the Minsk agreement, you can ask what where is the problem for Kiev, in fact. It allows more flexibility for the regions to use their language, for instance, and things like this. But so there are different issues. First of all, I used to be working in NATO based on an agreement, a special agreement between the Swiss government and NATO, and I had a position in NATO. I was monitoring the problem of the proliferation of small arms, and obviously that was an issue in Ukraine. And for that reason, I have been following the situation in Ukraine very tightly with the information I received from NATO. And I was surprised to see that even in Maidan, a lot of people, I mean, you had those right-wing extremists that were talking about a Ukraine for just Ukrainians. And that's part of the problem, probably. There were people that say we don't want Russians. And by the way, that raised a lot of questions, because if you see, for instance, some Baltic states, they don't have a status for Russian citizens. Some of them. I mean, if you go to Estonia and Latvia, for instance, they don't have a status for Russians. They are even considered as non-citizens. And some Russian-speaking, uh, I mean, non-citizens have, in fact, a European passport and not a Latvian passport, for instance. So meaning that the problem with those countries that emerged from the Soviet Union, they emerged with a very strong, if not ultra nationalistic approach uh, uh, to the idea of nation. I mean, the idea of nation in Switzerland is totally separate from the language, for instance. We can be Swiss as German, French, or Italian speaker without any problem. This is not something that divides us. But for many, and specifically in Ukraine, that was a dividing factor, especially from the new authorities coming. That's the first aspect. The second aspect is that obviously, and if you read the famous RAND report of April 2019, extending Russia and competing from advantageous ground or something like that. I don't remember the subtitle, but the main title is Extending Russia. It's a huge document of 300 pages that explains how to destabilize Russia. And in that, you could see that there was an idea that Russia must be destabilized. And that probably explained why the US, especially the administration in 2014, was so keen to promote a government that was adverse to Russia. It was an idea to, how to say that, to isolate Russia, in fact, already in 2014. And you had the first sanctions coming right after the Maidan and all that, with, and this idea of that Russia invaded Crimea, that was totally wrong, by the way. But anyway, and that prevented any diplomacy, because I think, and what I quoted my former colleague, the Swiss ambassador, and I think that's a little bit the mood that impregnates Western diplomacy regarding Ukraine. That we considered that Russia, and in fact, Russia was portrayed as the initiator of the conflict in 2014. And therefore, opening talks and talking to them was simply rewarding them. And I think that very much impregnated Western diplomacy at large. And in Europe, it's not very difficult to do so. Because especially of the new Europe, you may remember the expression of Donald Rumsfeld that made a difference between the old Europe, I mean the traditional Europe that was against the US intervention in Iraq, France, Germany, and so on, and Italy, Spain, and the new Europe that was very much in favor of the US policy at that time. And we see, and I experienced that within NATO as well. You can see a big divide in the mindset between those who come from the new Europe. I mean, the Baltic states, Poland, Czechia, and so on, and Romania, uh, and the new Europe. Even the officers have a totally different approach of even the Ukrainian conflict at that time. Even if their government was very much aligned with the Americans, but when I talk to my peers in NATO, even Western European Western officers, I mean, none were in favor of the split with Russia. That was very interesting when you had the private discussions. But on the other side, when you were talking to those people of New Europe, you had very much the feeling that it was deeper than simply policy. And I had the opportunity to work a little bit in the framework of my work in NATO with European Union and the European External Action Service. And I felt exactly the same thing in Europe. You had exactly the same kind of divide. The Eastern Europe is extremely emotionally related to the conflict in Ukraine and extremely adverse to Russia. And that explains why you don't have a very much diplomatic activity uh, in terms of maintaining relations with Russia. In addition to that, I think the main problem, if you look at the at European Union, for instance, is that they never. I mean, we have the feeling that what unites the Europeans is the hate against the Russians. You see, and I have the feeling that even the more we go, we proceed in time, the more that becomes the only point of convergence. Right, so probably not the only one, but and today you have Trump, which becomes another point of convergence probably in Europe. But in essence, this is the only thing that unites Europeans, or a very major thing that unites Europeans. And that's why the narrative in Europe seems to be so strongly directed against Russia. And when you have countries such as Hungary, which has a Hungarian minority in Ukraine, and this minority suffered from the new authorities that you have in Kiev, because as I said, in Kiev, the new authorities that emerged in 2014 wanted to have a Ukrainian's Ukraine. That means that all those Hungarians and Romanians who are part of Ukraine were in fact they had a lot of exaction against them, and the Hungary, the government of Hungary, complained on the Council of Europe several times against the behavior of the Ukrainian authority towards the minorities. The only thing is that it's a very tiny minority, or probably 200,000 people. So it's not a large majority. It's very important for the Hungarians, but it's when you go, you look at the map of Ukraine, it's a very much a minor minority. And of course, the Russian minority suffered more because also it's a bigger and there were probably other factors that affected, because beyond the Russian, you had the Soviet Union time and all that, and these ultranationalists have. We have to remember that the ultranationalists got their first independence, with quotation mark, provided by the Third Reich in 1941. And this is very interesting, because I got a document here from 1945 from the U.S. intelligence, and it's a document about the refugees, how to handle the refugees. That's after obviously the victory that was in the document is dated June 1914, and this document states we don't recognize the Ukrainian nationality. Ukraine is not recognized as a nationality, because at that time it was considered as a nationality that was provided by the Nazis. And but that's the view from the way, that's a Western view. But if you look at it from a Ukrainian point of view, of course they are grateful to some extent to the Nazis, because they provided them their first independence against the Soviet Union. And for them, Soviet Union was the real enemy, in fact. So it's a different in the perspective that I can perfectly understand, even if it's not in Europe, we always tend to think in black and white and all that. But I can understand those who relate the idea of independence to those who provided their first independence. So they may have today for us in Western Europe, especially in my case, that I have family, French family, who participated in the French resistance. This is quite odd to think that way, but if we try to understand the different point of views, we can understand that. But that what in fact affected all these elements affected our behavior toward Russia and prevented any dialogue with Russia. And that was exemplified but by what my colleague said that I mentioned before. So, and today what we see is that the European Union is almost in its own box. It has no presence in any conflict, by the way, because it focused so much at Russia that it has absolutely no presence when it comes to Palestine, for instance, Syria, Iran. You have nobody talks about European policy, foreign policy or diplomacy. People look at the US, even during the conflict in Palestine, people was looking at the Biden administration, Syria, same thing, Iran, obviously, but nobody talks about the Europeans, although the Europeans were part of the process of the GCPOA that was signed in 2015. So we see that a total collapse of the European diplomacy because this diplomacy is focused on Russia. And that's especially true with Kaja Kallas as the head of the EEAS, which obviously for her, this become like an obsession, almost like Ursula von der Leyen.
Well, yeah, this is the bit of a paradox with Kaja Kallas, who's now the, I guess, the foreign policy chief of the European Union, and she managed to make the statement that does not believe, she does not want to talk to the Russian president because he's a war criminal, and she does not talk to war criminals. So it's quite a remarkable statement to be made from, yeah, from a diplomat, of course.
To me, it's the question, why talk to him? I mean, why? He's a war criminal. I mean, I'm a lawyer by profession, and I looked up the definition of war crimes and genocide, for that matter. And it is the willingness to get rid of, part of the nation or a whole nation. And he has expressed this will, his intention. He has done steps for this, and he's a war criminal. And if you say that there is no outcome of talking to him, then why talk to him? Because I don't see into his head, of course, and into Kremlin's walls, but I feel that if everybody is constantly calling him, he doesn't get the message that he's isolated. So if we want to get him the message through that actually you're isolated, don't call him. It's no point.
It's exactly. I mean, and that relates very much to what I mentioned about my colleague in Kiev. We have the feeling that diplomacy has become a nice weather diplomacy, but it's not made for bad weather. And in fact, diplomacy is precisely here to help in case of bad weather, or even to prevent bad weather to become worse. That's the purpose of diplomacy, in fact.
But yeah, it's kind of, yeah, sad in one sense because Europe, we're supposed to be united by values, but it does appear that a lot of these values were, yeah, not that strong in the foundation. And when yeah, it really came down to it, seems to be more unity by hatred towards Russia. But I thought it was interesting what you mentioned about Latvia and Estonia as well, because I remember back in those days, yeah, it's been a while actually, but I remember when they were going to join the EU and NATO, the main arguments to the Russians was, you should be happy that they're joining the EU and NATO because we have our strong liberal democratic values. So all of these so-called non-citizens, and by the way, for anyone listening, these are people who were born in Latvia and Estonia. Their parents might have been born there, their grandparents might have been born there, but they're considered to be non-citizens. And yeah, for speaking the wrong language, and they can't vote, they can't get government jobs, they don't have the same rights for public schools, universities. It's kind of shocking, and the idea was, well, now they're joining the EU, NATO, the liberal democratic community. This should be the greatest reassurance that now things will be well. And now that was back in 2004, 21 years later. Um, where was this liberal democratic promise? I think the concern is if you give obviously the Russian-speaking and ethnic Russian minorities, they are much more sympathetic and well less hateful of Russia. So it would yeah, challenge the consensus perhaps in the EU that they might instead of being anti-Russian, they could be favorable. So yeah, I think this was also in the minds of the Russians when they looked at Ukraine being hijacked to a large extent by the Western powers. That if you're going to have a Ukraine where until 2014 the majority, only a small minority wanted to be a part of NATO, and the majority would have chosen partnership with Russia if they could. If you're going to bring this whole country, convert it into an anti-Russian front line, you're going to have some very strong oppression of and de-Russification of the public. But I want to ask you about what happened to the Europeans of 2008, because back in 2008, when at Bucharest, NATO summit in Bucharest in April of 2008, it was promised NATO expansion. At this time, I remember the Europeans were quite concerned. They didn't want to offer the membership action plan. According to Angela Merkel, it would be considered a declaration of war. But nonetheless, it was done. But at this point, the Europeans were aware of Russian security concerns, but they went along anyways. Then we had, as you outlined before, this years of this failed Minsk process, where yeah, we obviously had a key role. Even Angela Merkel, as you said, she recognized this, that they were just buying time. Franco Hollande, he said the same thing. He confirmed. Yet, how can we get so stuck in Europe in this unprovoked narrative? Because this is really what drives it. Everything is unprovoked. It's as if everything from 2008, Minsk, everything's gone, and suddenly, out of nowhere, the most recent reincarnation of Hitler emerged and now wants to conquer all of Europe. How is there no opposition to this narrative? Because it's so beyond the absurd.
You know, when you talk about the conflict in Iraq or in Afghanistan, nobody talks about unprovoked and unjustified. But when you address the question in Ukraine, every single commentator, I mean, those who are in favor of the Western narrative, obviously, but they use the word unjustified and unprovoked. So when you have such a narrative, that means that it was justified and provoked. Otherwise, you wouldn't have the need of underlining that. And I think it was provoked. First of all, again, I mentioned this comment from Alexei Arestovich of 2019, where he explains a very astonishing strategy that means that we need to have a war with Russia and to destroy Russia. So, and once Russia is destroyed, then there is no problem for Ukraine to enter NATO.
То есть, если Украина получает выдачу в НАТО, то тогда мы можем говорить о каких-то сроках прекращения войны.
Нет, ни о каких сроках прекращения войны мы не будем говорить. Наоборот, это, скорее всего, подтолкнет крупные военные операции России против Украины. Потому что они должны нас будут просадить в инфраструктурном отношении и превратить здесь все в разваленную территорию для того, чтобы нас неохотно брали.
То есть Россия сможет пойти на прямую конфронтацию с НАТО?
Конечно. Нет, не НАТО. Мы не они должны это сделать до того, как мы вступим в НАТО, чтобы мы не были интересны НАТО. Перестали быть интересны, как разваленная территория. С вероятностью 99,9% наша цена за вступление в НАТО – это большая война с Россией. А если мы не вступим в НАТО, это поглощение России в течение 10-12 лет. Вот и вся вилка, в которой мы находимся. А теперь давайте выбирайте Зеленского.
Подождите, а теперь если поставить чашу на весу, а что лучше в таком случае?
Конечно, крупная война с Россией и переход в НАТО по результатам победы над Россией.
And to some extent, there is again, I'm not in the planning room of the Ukrainian General Staff, but I can assume that's the plan that was followed. If you go back to the document I mentioned, and rank operation, I have to underline it, is the think tank of the Pentagon. It was created for the needs of the Pentagon at the end, or in the late 40s, to elaborate the nuclear strategy at the time, because they had a weapon but no strategy to use it. And since then, the rank operation has been the privileged think tank, and they have very good publications, by the way, even if obviously it's pro-American. But when it comes to that document that I mentioned before, extending Russia, when you go about, you look for the term provoke, you will see that on 8 occasions, because they suggest 6 measures to weaken Russia. Among them, by the way, it's to use Ukraine to destabilize Russia. On 8 occasions in the whole document, they say it will provoke a Russian intervention. On 8 occasions. And even if you look under risks, and if you look at the document, I think it's page 100 or so. In any case, if you read under risk, you will see that the authors of that study or the report said, be careful, because that could lead to loss of territories and human lives for the Ukrainians, and that will push Ukrainians into an unfavorable peace. So, meaning that they perfectly anticipated that the strategy they suggested in these documents was leading to war with Russia. And so that means that, and if you look at the measures that were provoked, you can look at the 6 measures are those you have seen happening in the last 3 years. That consider Central Asia. I mean, there are different factors. I don't have them in mind right now, but it's very fascinating to see that how these guys were so, they designed those 6 measures and they analyzed them, but they also saw the risks of that. And we are exactly what we're witnessing these days are exactly the risks that were anticipated by those who suggested or proposed that strategy. So everything is self-explanatory to some extent. But this was an idea, and here we have to understand that there are 2 layers of the conflict, and we have to be careful not to mix them, because what Emmanuel Macron said last Friday in his address to the public, the French public, he created confusion by confusing those layers. The deepest layer is obviously the problem with NATO. But this problem is a problem that could be solved quite easily. Remember that Russia is not adverse to NATO as such, because even Russia proposed to be part of NATO. And when I was in NATO, I started in NATO in 2012. And at that time, Maidan had not occurred yet. And Russia, as well as Belarus and others, were part of the so-called Partnership for Peace and of the Euro-Atlantic Partnership Council. And that's the framework in which I was, in fact, that allowed my country to have a position for me in NATO. I was the only Swiss working in NATO. But the Russians were there too, meaning that the Russians had regular discussions and normal discussions with NATO. They were not against NATO. Well, the problem is, and I think the real problem started when in 2002 and later, when the Bush administration and the Obama and then the Trump administration started to abandon all the disarmament treaties. And the first one was the ABM treaty that was used by the Bush administration to station anti-ballistic missile in Poland, Czechia, and or Romania. And the problem is that the launchers that are used, or they were planned at that time to be in Poland and so on, are dual use. That means you can either use them for anti-ballistic purposes, but you can also use them for ballistic missiles. Meaning that if you look at it from Russia, the point of view of Russia, you never know exactly what is in those launchers. And that is a potential risk. And at this point, Russia started to invoke the Astana Declaration, and namely of 2010, and namely the principle of indivisibility of security, meaning that according to this declaration, the Astana Declaration is a OSCE document that was signed among all the participants of the Euro-Atlantic Euro-Atlantic organization. And the basic principle of the indivisibility of security is that you cannot promote your own security at the expense of the security of your neighbors. Therefore, stationing missiles or nuclear missiles on your territory is not essentially could be allowed, but since it creates a problem for your neighbor, then it's not allowed, because that's a problem of indivisibility of security, and that's an issue that has been repeatedly invoked by the Russians. And that's, I think, a key point that nobody pays attention to, but it's a reality that you have to be careful. And if you have an organization where you have a constant dialogue among each other, then you solve these problems. And that relates to the issue that has been also repeatedly invoked by the Russians, is the security by cooperation instead of the security by confrontation. And that's the principle. Remember that I mentioned the OSCE, the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that started as the Conference for Security and Cooperation in Europe, that initially was a project from the Soviet Union. It started as a project of the Soviet Union, and that developed into the Helsinki process, and that it ended as the OSCE. But this idea of security and cooperation is a key aspect of the Russian understanding of the security of the continent. And I think, regardless of whether we are pro or against Russia, it's not the issue here. But we see that NATO as a structure is not tailored for the kind of problem that we have, as an example, in Ukraine and other examples. I mean, the Balkans could be another example. The NATO is oversized for this because it was designed for the nuclear war. And we see that if we have a problem in Europe, it cannot be used by using nuclear weapons. And therefore, the security of the continent must not be based on the confrontation as it was during the Cold War, where we had two confronting blocks. But here we have to have another type of security. And I am a firm advocate of the security by cooperation. By the way, it's also the basic tenet of the Swiss security policy is the security by cooperation, security by cooperating with your neighbors. You don't want to antagonize your neighbors. You try to cooperate with them. This has pro and cons, and there are also disadvantages, but that's the best way to ensure your security. And I think this view, which may come when you mentioned the condition of what may come with this peace process, we may end up with something like this. I don't know. Again, I don't have the crystal ball. But that's the first layer of the conflict in Ukraine. The second layer, and I think it's very important to remind this to people, the reason why Russians entered Ukraine is not because of NATO. It's because of the protection of the civilians. That's the rationale for entering Ukraine. And that's very important to say, because when we hear Emmanuel Macron today that said, well, after Ukraine, Russia will attack Europe, because we put the rationale, a different rationale. It's a kind of, it's not, we are no longer even in rebuilding Soviet Union, because obviously Western Europe has never belonged to Soviet Union. So it goes beyond that. And that's this idea that the reason for Russia to enter Ukraine was based on irrational decision. In fact, the decision to enter Ukraine was perfectly rational. It was perfectly limited to the protection of civilians. And that relates into what Vladimir Putin said on the 24th of February 2022, when he said the two objectives are demilitarization, that means to relieve or to remove the military pressure on the Russian population, and denazification, which is to remove the pressure of those paramilitaries against the population. And you may remember then that just before the signature or the partial signature of the agreement in Istanbul on the 28th of March 2022, the Russian military declared the objective of denazification reached. That's the point where they surrounded Mariupol, where you had the Azov regiment or brigade, depending on, I mean, it was a big regiment, but at the time when the Azov regiment was surrounded in Mariupol, the Russian military said, we have achieved the objective of denazification, while the objective of demilitarization was in fact ongoing. And since the Europeans keep feeding the Ukrainians, obviously we are always rebuilding not reinventing the wheel, but recreating the problem, because you may remember that in June 2022, Zelensky said, from that point on, we are depending on the West, meaning that his army had been destroyed, had been completely demilitarized at that time. And the subsequent support that was provided by the Europeans from June to December 2022, with old Soviet equipment coming from the Eastern European countries. That was the first batch of equipment. Then this batch was destroyed. It was demilitarized a second time. And from that point, Zaluzhny asked for having M1 Abrams and Leopard 2 and things like this. And that's what we saw appearing on the theater at the very beginning of 2023. And that allowed the Ukrainians to start their so-called counteroffensive in June 2023, and that was destroyed again. And then you had all for asking new equipment, and then you had the Patriots and all these I would say higher technology equipment that was provided to the Ukrainians, because they had been demilitarized for a third time. And today we are in a situation that they are completely demilitarized, but the situation today is even worse because the Americans don't have any more resources to provide to them, and the Europeans are completely exhausted. Now they have to take their own stock to provide this. So meaning that the more we go with time, the less the Europeans are able to, in fact, fulfill their promise, because we have to remember that in April 2022, when Zelensky withdrew his proposal to the Russians, that was signed by the Ukrainian delegation, and the Russians was about to sign it's part of the agreement, but Boris Johnson came and said, no, you withdraw your proposal. At that time, Zelensky traded peace against unlimited support. And that's the reason why Zelensky comes and keeps coming to ask for equipment, because he was promised this equipment. He was promised unlimited support. The problem is that since it was the case at the very beginning of the offensive, and I remember on the 1st March of 2022, the French Minister of Economy saying, we will make Russia to collapse, and he was suggesting that it would happen within weeks, because we underestimated the military, economic, and societal resilience of the Russians, and we thought that it would collapse much quicker than it happened. And therefore, Zelensky now is trapped into a situation where he abandoned his prospect for peace against a promise that the West is not able to fulfill because Russia is stronger as anticipated.
Well, it provides a nice segue into what I wanted to go to next. I wanted to ask you about the possibility for peace, because it does appear that the war is coming to an end, and that's either on the battlefield or through negotiations. Now, earlier you have argued that in the wider context, again, what has caused the collapse and the war and the collapse of the European security architecture has been the failure to recognize this key principle of indivisible security. That is, one side should not increase its security at the expense of another. And what is quite interesting is this has almost been a strategy, an approach to do this, simply because this has been the model for a hegemonic peace, which manifested itself through NATO expansion. Because the month before, NATO promised Ukraine future membership in 2008. That is, in March of 2008, the former British Prime Minister Tony Blair, in a WikiLeaks cable, he apparently told the Americans that our main strategy towards Russia should be to make it a bit or a little desperate, was the quote, with our activities on the borders along Russia. And again, this goes in contrast with what traditional security would be like. That is, the great powers do not try to enhance their own security at the expense of the other. But in this instance, it was the actual goal, and we saw also this in the Rand paper from 2019. The argument was that if we threaten with NATO expansion, this will make the Russians feel compelled to invest more treasure in blood into Donbass, again back in 2019. But I wanted to ask you how, just to feel out the possibility here for a peace agreement, because irrespective of any of the talks and big bluster from the Trump administration, it's a good point of departure to start from what the Russians want, because they are winning the war. So what is it that Russia wants from negotiations? That is ideally, but also where do you see it would be willing to compromise, and what is the minimum demand, I guess, versus its stated objectives?
We know exactly the position of the Russians at this stage. I mean, they said to initiate the process, to engage into the negotiation. There are two conditions that must be fulfilled. The first one is that you have no Ukrainian presence in the 4 oblasts of Kherson, Zaporozhye, Donetsk, and Lugansk. That's clear. And the second one is the neutrality of Ukraine. And that's probably the trickiest part, because that's where you may have today there is a common understanding, let's put it that way. I'm not sure the Ukrainians are totally I agree with that, but when we see the polls made in Ukraine, we see that more and more people understand that the reality on the ground is such that Ukraine will have to give up with to recover the territory that was lost to the Russians. And in addition, for the Russians, we have also to say that keeping those territories is not just for the sake of having a territorial expansion, even if it's obviously a land bridge to Crimea and all that. This is clear. But there's a second thing that nobody mentions. It's also a way to avoid the the population within those republics to be subjected to revenge violence if it was given back to the Ukrainians. Exactly what the Russians experienced in 2014. We have, because after the uprising I mentioned in 2014, you had a lot of revenge action from those paramilitaries, and that in fact started to radicalize, or very much antagonizing the two communities. So keeping those territory, this is one thing, but everybody starts to admit that probably Ukraine will have to abandon those territories. The second thing is the neutrality. And here we have to be very clear. If you look at the constitution of Ukraine, the previous constitution, there's one in 1991 and one in 1996, they don't mention neutrality. They don't mention the neutrality, but they say that there will be no foreign bases and foreign troops in Ukraine, which can be interpreted to some kind of neutrality, but it was not formal neutrality. It was, and it's important because a lot of commentators think that it was neutrality and therefore Ukraine was not entitled to join NATO. I think that's probably in the CIS treaty that was signed when the Soviet Union split, that there was an idea of not belonging to alliances. I'm not sure about this, but that's probably there that you have that. But in the Ukrainian constitution, you don't have that, but you certainly have explicitly said that it shouldn't be no foreign troops and no further foreign bases in the country. Meaning that in theory, the idea of being part of an alliance could be allowed. That's here where the indivisibility of security come into the game, because obviously having Ukraine as part of the NATO and having the risk of having NATO troops, as it happened in Poland, in the Baltic states, and in other countries, and even the station of those missiles. And that explains, by the way, the famous speech of Vladimir Putin in Munich in 2007. That's exactly what triggered his famous speech that eventually pressed the Western countries to ask for NATO and all that. They felt kind of offended by his position, but the Russian position was totally legitimate at that point. In any case, that will be the trickiest point, because everybody says, well, Ukraine should be sovereign and have the right to, and blah, blah, blah. And that's where probably, if we want to solve the problem, we'll have to rethink the whole European security architecture. That's my personal view, because, by the way, what's happening these days, that the Europeans feel abandoned by the Trump administration, feel the need to have an independent security policy, an independent defense, and all that, meaning that there are probably some thoughts in Europe. The problem is that I'm not sure those thoughts are very constructive. They are directed at Russia rather than directed at having a better security system that provides security by cooperation precisely, and not by confrontation. I think we are very much in a kind of confrontational mood. So what's happening today could be a good starting point to have something new and a new approach of security, but it's not the case. And it's not the case for two reasons, or one reason. If you want a security policy, and that applies to any country and obviously also for the European Union, a security policy is based on two pillars: the foreign policy and the defense policy, to make it simple. And every country has both, basically, and plays alternatively with, obviously most often with the foreign policy rather than the defense policy. But these are the two pillars. And defense policy would be probably more for bad weather, and foreign policy for good weather. I don't know. And you have an overlap when you have troubled times. But this is the idea. Now, if you look at the European Union, as we said before, it has no foreign policy. I mean, no foreign diplomacy. There is nothing. There is an institution, but it's not used as it should. And they're not. When we see the conflicts, such as Ukraine, there is no real foreign policy because we don't know exactly what this foreign policy aims at. I mean, so far it has just provided weapons, which is not really foreign policy in my view. And we see that there is no alternative discussion. There is no alternative planning. And we see that even as we said before, Trump has announced already 1 year ago, before being elected, that he would make every effort to stop the conflict in Ukraine. And after being elected, obviously, he started to take measures to stop this conflict. He nominated Case Kellogg and all that in order to have instruments to stop the conflict. I'm not sure he understood the conflict well, but that's another topic. But he wanted to do so. But interestingly enough, everybody knew that. It was in the news, in the media, and all that. But European Union did nothing. There's absolutely no move of the External Action Service to provide any alternative plan or to counter Trump or to find some way to accommodate the US policy with the European policy and things like that. They did nothing, zero. They were just surprised as Trump announced the meeting in Riyadh between the Russians and the US delegation. So meaning that the Europeans were absolutely not prepared for that. And that shows that there is absolutely no foreign policy. They were focusing at weakening and destroying Russia, period. There is no alternative plan. There is no other focus. There is nothing, other priorities, nothing else. It's just that. That's the first thing. And now they notice that they don't have even a defense policy. And even if we were talking about a defense policy that could be, let's say, materialized at this stage by sending troops in Ukraine, only two countries can do that. That's France and UK. And UK is not even part of the EU. So that means that even the defense policy doesn't exist. So we are talking about a security policy by an organization that has absolutely no plan, not even the institutions. And even when we talk about, now we are talking about rearm Europe and all that. So I'm not even discussing the issue of rebuilding a military industrial complex in Europe. By the way, if this military complex, industrial complex, not collapsed, but was reduced in Europe, that's for the reason that at that time we didn't feel to need one. That's very important. That's because after the Cold War, we felt that the Cold War could provide a framework to have a real peaceful coexistence. And therefore, we can reduce our military expense, our military apparatuses, and the military industrial complex to the minimum, because we still need an army. I'm former colonel of the Swiss army, so I'm definitely not against any army, under the principle that you always have an army on your territory, either yours or the army of someone else. So therefore you need an army, but you probably don't need to have exactly the same level of preparedness if you feel at peace with your neighbors than if you feel at war. And that's exactly the reason why our military industrial complex was reduced after the Cold War. And so it's not necessarily a bad thing. The problem is that today, and you see that even Emmanuel Macron has to create a threat. He has to invent the idea that Russia is ready to attack Ukraine, Europe and all that in order to provoke this move towards a rearmament of Europe. So, and that shows definitely that in Europe, nobody thought about this, and everything come suddenly here these days. Suddenly, we want to send troops and spend 800 billion euros for defense and all that, and we have to rebuild our armies and reestablish military service, compulsory military service, and all that come in 1 week. And that shows exactly that we have no policy. There is no thinking. There is no plan. There is no thinking behind how do we see the future of our security. Sorry, I was.
Yeah, no, in Germany now discussing the need for nuclear weapons. I mean, a lot of this is just reactions. Yeah, a bit of a panic. We keep beating our chest, and you're doing this, yeah, things we haven't really thought about. And I think a lot of decisions have been wrong, which yeah, demonstrates this geopolitical immaturity. Of course, you can blame it from outsourcing a lot of our foreign policy to the Americans for 80 years. But yeah, my last question is about what you see coming now from Europe, because of course you can argue that this, the first rule of geopolitics, don't put all your eggs in one basket. In this sense, betting everything on the United States, somehow that the US will put the European interest ahead of itself. But also, I guess the problem of defining European interests, given that, as you mentioned, the only objective seems to be that we have to continue fighting Russia. And we haven't even discussed what defeating Russia, that is defeating the world's largest nuclear power, would actually look like. So there's a lot of absence of strategic thinking. But where can Europe go from here, and where is it likely going? Are we drifting into irrelevance? Certainly, the military doesn't seem great. Economically, also it appears to be weakened. Geopolitically, at least, the feeling more and more isolated. In the past, at least, the diplomacy would take place on European soil. Now, we're not invited to the talks, and they go talk somewhere else. The Russians, the Americans, nobody wants the Europeans around, and they don't need them. They're seen as being unrealistic. They're seen as being unreliable. None of this. This is not great for us. I mean, for us Europeans. So, are we drifting to irrelevance? And do you see any way we can move away from this path?
Well, the problem is that today we have conflicting timelines. First of all, I think the Americans want now to have they want to have the conflict in Ukraine behind them. That means that for now what they want is to press both parties, Russia and Ukraine, to the negotiation table, and they want to avoid the Europeans to be involved in that. And the Europeans, because they don't have any significant presence. I mean, as you rightly said, we don't know exactly what the Europeans want to achieve, because continuing the war is not an achievement. See, where does it lead to? And nobody knows that. And I think even in Europe, nobody knows that. It's just about fighting Russia, period. But to which point? How can we define the victory for Ukraine or the defeat for Russia? And what is the point where we decide we stop fighting? Nobody knows that at all. So now you have a Europe that is just pleading for more war, but without knowing up to which point. Are they waiting for Ukraine to be destroyed? Because we are definitely in an attrition war. And in an attrition war, I mean, obviously, if you are the weakest, will be even weaker. And the more time you give to the attrition war to happen, the surest is that the weaker or the weakest will become even weaker and will eventually disappear. So the logic of having the perpetrating the war has absolutely no sense from my point of view. And I think the Americans have identified this, and therefore they want to keep the Europeans at bay, and they want to have, and they probably don't even want to be directly involved in the discussion themselves. They just want to promote a dialogue and to have a settlement, period. I'm not sure they want a specific settlement, by the way, but they understand that if we let things going on, and I think Trump has expressed many times this, is that if things continue like this, Ukraine will disappear. And that was even stated by some, even Kirilo Budanov, the head of the military intelligence, stated something like this, meaning that I think the idea of continuing alimenting and feeding the battlefield doesn't make any sense. The problem is that nobody feels in Europe that it has no sense. And I think this is the first timeline is to have a settlement in Ukraine. And the second timeline is to define, as we discussed before, a foreign policy, a defense policy, a security policy, a new European security architecture, and all that. And that will take time. Even if when we just take the declaration of Ursula von der Leyen with the rearm Europe, and what the Americans want, we see that a huge discrepancy, because even if you invest 800 billion, first of all, you will not invest that in one day, meaning that rebuilding, rearming Europe will take years, while Emmanuel Macron speaks about an existential threat in the coming weeks from Russia. So we see that we are here between definitely conflicting timeline, showing also the, as you rightly mentioned, the immaturity of the European politicians. And I think that's the real problem. Now, my personal view is that the Trump administration will somehow enforce a dialogue, will enforce a negotiation process. Whether it will be in favor of Ukraine, I'm doubtful, because, as you rightly said, Russia is winning. And at the end of the day, if they are winning and in such way, there is no incentive for them to have a discussion. When we talk about, we started with the issue of the 30 days ceasefire. What is the incentive for Russia to have a ceasefire? They are winning. The incentive is just for Ukraine. So what do they receive as a counterpart of the ceasefire? You see, so the reality is that if they were equal on a battlefield, if you had a real stalemate, as people think, then you could say, okay, there is, we have to give a little bit to each. But the problem is that today Russia is definitely winning. And what happened in the Kursk Oblast in the last couple of days shows that the Russians are definitely on the victory path. Meaning that we are here on a situation that we need to find a rapid solution, and the response from the Europeans is only mid to long term. And therefore, I don't see exactly how the Europeans can fit into the process that the Americans are sponsoring in Ukraine. And my view is that the Americans will continue with their process. They will make put pressure on the Ukrainians to achieve that. We hope it will come to a good peace, but again, that will be decided half on the battlefield, because as long as the Russians don't have on the negotiation table what they expect, they will continue fighting. Meaning that at the end of the day, the result of the peace process will come from both the battlefield and the negotiation table. And that's what the Europeans are not have not understood. Now, they will probably have a passenger seat on the process, because that's the European Union, and they probably force their way into the process. But I'm not sure that the American will allow them to have a strong voice into that, because they know that they don't want even the process to happen. So it's a very difficult position viewed from the Americans, and they probably make every effort to avoid the Europeans to be involved in that. And for the Europeans, at the end of the day, because they have no foreign policy, because they have no objectives, because they have no strategy, because they don't know exactly what they want to achieve except just fighting Russia, they will be sidelined. And that's, I think, I would hope, but it's only a hope, because I'm sure it will never happen. I mean, under current constellation and leadership, we could only hope that it could trigger the need for the Europeans to rethink their foreign policy, to rethink the way they, not just in the framework of the Ukrainian conflict and the relations with Russia, but also with the whole South, because we see that Europe is disconnected from everywhere. And it will be disconnected from the US also, because the US, because of the tariffs and all that, they want just to take jobs from Europe to the US, and that will increase the isolation of Europe. And in fact, the Europeans have not even understood that. Meaning that we are in these days, in the day we are living in today, we should have, I mean, the Europeans should have recognized or identified the opportunity to rethink their own future, their own architecture, their own, in German you would say, Weltanschauung, because that's their understanding of the world somehow. Because in my view, they have been completely focused on the Ukrainian conflict and the fight against Russia, and they have lost of sight the rest of the world, even their own economy, and now they are realizing that they are under the shock and panic, because they see that they are on the Atlantic side, they are between the US, they are between China, because now they have antagonized everybody. The Russians are not very keen to resume relations with Europe, in fact, because now they have reconstructed the networks towards Eurasia, Asia. They have reestablished contact with the South. They have reorganized their markets towards the South. And today, and even when we talk about gas, for instance, even the Ukrainians have destroyed the pipelines, Nord Stream, I don't even need to mention that, meaning that for the Russians, I mean, going back towards Europe is a liability, meaning that for Europe, they are in fact more and more disconnected from the rest of the world. And they haven't realized that so far, because they feel they just think among themselves in their bubble, but they are in the bubble. And I think this is I think a mindset problem. And the elites we have, I mean, if you think about Keir Starmer, when you see Annalena Baerbock, when you see Ursula von der Leyen and all that, these guys are completely in their own world. I mean, they don't understand what's happening outside the borders of Europe. And that's, I think, probably we should have a massive change in the leadership in Europe, to have people who start thinking differently. We have to reset the whole European thinking. That's my view. And that will happen, I mean, obviously not in one day. That will take some time. But we see already moves. We have seen that in Germany. We have seen that in certain countries. But this is not, I'm not sure it's even the best move, because we don't want to come back into some kind of nationalistic ideologies. This is not the idea. We should have people who think about how to better work together. And my personal view, well, that's my personal view, I'm not antagonistic to Europe. I think Maastricht was the bridge too far. And that having a common market, what we had before Maastricht was the best for Europe, keeping the identities of each country, cooperating with each other, facilitating trade and exchanges and all that, but starting to have common structures, common uh, 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 um, Führungsstrukturen. I have the word in German. Sorry about that, but the a leadership and overhead structures is too much for Europe. We are too diverse. The Estonians don't have the same aspiration, the same understanding of the world than the Portuguese. You are from Norway. I'm from Switzerland. We are two countries that are known for their, let's say, fair understanding of the world. But even though you have a Nordic view, I have a more Central Europe understanding of things. So there are differences. We can find common grounds, but there are differences, and it will be very difficult to unify all this into some kind of fludsy project, having someone looking in the same direction, having the same aspiration. We are too diverse for that. That's my personal view, and somebody has to rethink this whole European architecture. We should improve cooperation. We should improve the trade among us. We should improve the way we can interact with each other. All that needs to improve. But I think going into the same structure and belong to the same structure, the same political system with people who are not even elected in Brussels, I think that's really a bridge too far. And Maastricht, my view is that Maastricht was just the bridge too far.
I think this is a feature in in human nature that is we look at our own group in group as it is and we exaggerate the similarities. We think we're very similar, and then we look at the out group, our opponents, and we assume there is nothing in common, complete opposites. And yeah, if this can be addressed, usually many problems can be solved. That is that the Europeans yes, as mentioned, from Norway to Switzerland, they're very different countries, and we often exaggerate how much there is in common, which is it can be a good thing to have this European diversity. Indeed, this reflects the idea around the Greek city-states, the vitality it gains. So one shouldn't throw this away and also accumulate a lot of problem by forcing everyone into the same box. And it's the same with the Americans. There are some, and especially in this country, the politicians are quite wild. The assumption that because we're allies, our interest will be almost completely overlapped. I mean, we will have different interests. The great power will look after its own interests first. This should be common sense, but we assume everything is exactly the same because we're in the same block. And then we look at the outgroup, the Russians, and yeah, they're always the complete opposite to us. They are our other every single time, and we exaggerate and underestimate how little how much we actually have in common because it's not that different. So no, I'm hoping there will be some changes, but I'm not yeah, a bit pessimistic these days, I guess.
We should take advantage of our differences, but we should exploit our similarities. But saying, as you said, as you rightly said, putting everybody in the same box with the same objective, with the same line, with the same, we are recreating the Soviet Union in Europe today. And we see that, by the way, by the freedom of press, freedom of expression, and all that. We say that everything has to be aligned on the same thing, and that's, I think, is going too far. We are going too far, but
Yeah.
anyway.
Well, the British scholar David Mitrani, he wrote in the 1960s that if the European would go for a federalist model, that is, that the objective in itself should be to federalize. He predicted Europe would start to look, Western Europe at that time would start to look more and more like the Soviet Union. So you might be onto something there. Anyways, Colonel Baud, I really appreciate your time. You've been very kind to give so much of it. So thank you. This has been widely, sorry, interesting, and I really hope, yeah, we get to speak with you again in the future. So thanks
Pleasure.
again.
That was a pleasure. Thank you for inviting me today. Thank you very much.